Welcome to the School of Hofstra, the show where we get abstract and talk about all things philosophy. I'm your host, Ella Marsh. One of the most fundamental topics in philosophy is freedom. What is it? Where does it come from? How does it work? There are plenty of debates and questions on what freedom actually is. With me today to discuss are philosophy professors Dr. Amy Karofsky and Dr. Mark McEvoy. Thank you for joining us today. If we could just start off with a brief introduction touching on how long you've worked here, what philosophical areas interest you, and then what you're going to teach in the fall.
So this is my 24th year here at Hofstra. My main area of interest is the theory of necessitarianism. In the fall, I'll be teaching Introduction to Philosophy and Philosophic Themes in Film.
Awesome. Thank you. And
I've been here 18 years, and my main areas of interest are philosophy of mathematics and epistemology, or the theory of what knowledge is and how we get it. In the fall semester, I'll be teaching philosophy of language and 2 sections of philosophy and the meaning of life.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We'll definitely have a lot to talk about tonight. Before we get started here with our live chat, let's take a look at some important notes about free will with Dr. Anthony Dardis and Dr. Terry Godlove.
Freedom of will is the ability to choose one thing rather than another. Freedom of will doesn't always translate into action because the world doesn't always cooperate.
On one side of the debate, there are the folks who are called necessitarians, and they pretty much think that since every event is necessitated or required, caused by a prior event, that then no event can be spontaneous. In that sense, freedom in the sense of spontaneity is not possible. The other far end of the spectrum, there are the folks who think that causation is an illusion, so that no events are necessarily connected, in which case every event, in some sense, is going to be spontaneous. In the middle, there are people who think that, events are necessarily caused, but that still, in some fashion, some, at least human events, can be free in the sense of spontaneous.
It's a very old issue. I mean, I think the oldest texts that we know of that have gods in them, or people, or thinking about human nature, have questions in them about free will. The Roman philosopher Lucretius in 48 BCE wrote a book called On the Nature of Things, and he very explicitly raised the question of free will in physics. Early Christian thinkers, particularly St. Augustine, focused a lot on care for one's soul and for one's will. We have to have free will for the moral framework of Christianity to make sense, but it's not at all easy to see how the omnipotent, omniscient God does not rule out free will. You cannot be held morally responsible for something that happens to you which is not the product of your will. If you have an accident and you fall into somebody, if it's clear that it's an accident, then we will not count you as morally responsible.
We do the right thing when we act freely. By implication, I guess we do the wrong thing when we fail to act freely.
The scientific revolution, which you could date to Copernicus in 1543 arguing for the heliocentric solar system, makes it overwhelmingly likely that the world really is a physical system. And so the problem of physical determinism becomes probably the most, it becomes at least as pressing as the various theological versions of the problem. Physical law determinism is given the distribution of matter throughout the universe at a moment, and the laws of physics, how things are throughout the rest of time, are set. 2 possibilities physically exactly alike up to a moment will be physically exactly alike for the rest of time.
Hume had the temerity to suggest that perhaps laws of nature were merely statistical regularities. So Hume's suggestion has come down to us in the present. That recasts the whole free will debate.
That's how I see the history of the topic in philosophy. Like I say, it's been going on forever. Probably will go on forever, but at the moment I see hope. I think there's a way around it, but we'll see.
As we discuss free will today, feel free to submit any questions you have for our professors in the live chat. We'll ask some of those questions at the end of the show. So to start off our main discussion, we're just going to talk briefly about your own positions on free will, whether or not you think that it's something that exists. Starting again with Dr. Karofsky.
So, as a necessitarian, I believe that absolutely nothing about the world could have been otherwise. So, if free will means the ability to do otherwise, I don't believe that we have free will. I also tend to believe that we are just a bunch of physical stuff. So that would mean that we don't have anything like a non-physical mind. And I tend to believe that physical stuff does react in a very deterministic way. So that would seem to mean then that everything that I do and all human actions are also determined in the same way that physical stuff in the world is. And so there too, I think that if our actions are determined in that way, that we don't have free will. It would seem that my position is mostly that of the necessitarian, but I do think that I am somewhat sympathetic with determinism, as long as there's genuine causation in the world.
Good. Thank you. And then?
So there are really two different concepts of freedom, and one of them, as we just heard from Professor Karofsky, is this idea that I could have done something differently than I actually did. And sometimes the analogy where we think of the history of the universe as a movie helps, right? We run the movie once, you wear that particular black shirt you're wearing, we run the movie a second time, and if you're free in this non-determined sense, you really could have picked a different top to wear. I'm in agreement with Professor Karofsky that we don't have that kind of freedom. I differ on some of the details, as we'll see, but I agree that we don't have that kind of freedom. But there is another concept of freedom, which basically means just freedom from coercion, right? So if you get tired of listening to us and you decide you just want to walk off set and do something else, that's a free action. If, on the other hand, somebody comes in, puts a gun to your head and says, you better get out of here or I'm going to shoot you, right, then we don't think that that's free. Now, both of them could be determined. If determinism is true, then both of them will be determined. But there seems to be a clear difference between those two ways in which you might leave the room. And we might well think of the first one as free in the absence of coercion, and the second one as being coerced and not at all free.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Yeah, and so I know that we've been talking a little bit about determinism, and I know on the other side of that is libertarianism. So if we want to just kind of establish both of those things so that people at home get a good understanding of what that is, because those are the main points in normal free will discussion.
Yeah, so what Professor McEvoy was just describing, the type of free will that would result if it was genuinely possible that you could have worn a purple polka-dotted shirt today, that would have been then something that you could have done otherwise. And the thought would be then that you wore the shirt that you did as a matter of free will. That's the libertarian account, the idea that a free act is one that one could have done otherwise. And then the determinist would say, there is no free will. Our events are determined by prior causes, and as such, there is no free will, certainly not in the libertarian sense. Professor McEvoy's position is typically described as the compatibilist position, and it's it allows for a different type of free will then. Rather than being the ability to do otherwise, it focuses more on the way in which an act is done. If you voluntarily choose to leave, then you are leaving freely on the compatibilist sense, even if you couldn't have done otherwise. And so it avoids some of the problems of libertarianism. And it's interesting how similar then the determinist and the compatibilist positions are. The determinist and the compatibilist would agree that there really is only one way that this world can play out. But according to the compatibilists, some human actions are free, and according to the determinists, no human actions are free.
Yeah. So you would probably say, as we've been discussing, you align a little bit more with like compatibilism.
Well, in a true philosophical sense, yes and no.
Okay.
I think there's something to the compatibilist sense of freedom. I think it's worthwhile distinguishing between coerced actions and actions that are voluntary, even if they couldn't have happened other than they did. The reason I don't think of myself as a compatibilist is, in addition to thinking that libertarian free will is false, I also think determinism is false.
Okay.
And the reason that I think that has to do with what physicists tell us is happening at the quantum level. So at the subatomic quantum level, we're told that causation isn't deterministic, but it's rather probable. It's probabilistic. And what that amounts to, just to make some numbers up off the top of my head, is if the probability that one quantum event causes another is 99.5%, that means if we got the history of the universe to play out 100 times, or 1,000 times rather, 5 of those times the first event would not bring about the second event, but something different would happen instead. Right? So if that's correct, then it seems like there is room for alternate possibilities, things happening differently than they actually have happened.
And I know you gave us an example briefly, if you would want to kind of explain that.
The Geiger counter thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, so people sometimes defend determinism against the quantum mechanics objection by saying, yeah, but look, that's just at the quantum level, at the regular macro level where people exist. We don't have probabilistic causation, we still have determinism. And Elizabeth Anscombe, the 20th century philosopher, gave an example that tries to tie together the quantum world with the macro world of the people world, so that objection doesn't quite work. The example is this: we have a bomb that is attached to a Geiger counter and a clock timer. And if the Geiger counter registers atomic decay at, let's say, 3 o'clock, then there'll be an explosion. And if the Geiger counter does not register decay, then there won't be an explosion. The thing is that at the level of atomic decay, causation is supposed to be probabilistic. So there's, say, a 99.5% chance that the Geiger counter will register and explode, but a 0.5% chance that it won't register and therefore won't explode. So we connect the quantum world with the people world in that way, and we seem to have an example of probabilistic, not determined causation.
And I know that you have some ideas about this in terms of agreeing and like a little bit of disagreeing.
So it seems to me that part of what the determinist would do is to say that it's to reject the idea that there could be indeterminacy even at the quantum level. And so perhaps I think one way for the determinist to react is just to Professor McEvoy's example is to deny that there is indeterminism even at the quantum level. It seems to me that the necessitarian need not necessarily get into the discussion about whether or not there is indeterminacy at the quantum level. Perhaps the necessitarian might say something like, even if something at that level could happen as a result of non-determinate causation or as a matter of indeterminacy, that doesn't necessarily mean that it could have happened otherwise. So that the position would still need to provide some further support for the possibility that something else could have happened instead. And so I think there might be two different ways to respond to that example, depending on whether somebody wants to defend the doctrine of universal causation. But the necessitarian doesn't necessarily have to defend that position. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. And I know we've been talking about objections a little bit already, but I think we're going to move into trying to target some more objections and maybe also approaches of other philosophers that we kind of disagree with and stuff like that. So I think first and foremost, libertarianism is kind of not something that we agree with, both of you.
Yeah.
That seems fair.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then determinism, sentimental.
Yeah, somewhat sympathetic. I agree with it if there is genuine causation. That question is still a little up in the air, it seems to me. If there is genuine causation in the world, then I do think that it happens in a determinate way.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And we would not be anywhere close to figuring out how that would come about.
Yeah, I guess, Hume raises that really interesting problem that when we see one ball hitting another, all we can see is the one ball hitting the other, and we don't see causation, we don't see cause, we don't see effect. I think the problem is compounded when we think about the way that that one ball does hit the other. It's not like there's like one distinct cause.
Yeah.
There are a whole bunch of things going on in that scenario that involve that first ball moving, and there isn't just one distinct event. There's a whole lot going on. So it is kind of strange to suggest that there's a cause that causes each and every event that has a distinct cause, and that there's a distinct event that follows from each distinct cause. So I think that is a difficult position to defend. So I do wonder whether Hume was on the right track in saying, maybe we ought to be a little skeptical of our use of cause and effect and our account of causation. He was appealing to the fact that we can't see it, but I wonder if it could be developed even further to the point that we can't even adequately distinguish a cause specifically and the event that would follow specifically.
Okay, very interesting. And I know something that we talked about earlier on our own kind of was causation in relation to event and also agent. So if you'd like to talk about that, because that kind of brings in free will a little bit more.
Sure. So one move that a libertarian can make is to distinguish between different types of causation. And this runs at a different angle than the Hume skepticism about causation. Suppose there is causation amongst events. We can think of this like dominoes, where you flick over the first domino and it causes the second one to fall over, and so on down the line. That's event causation. One event happens, it causes another event. The agent causation supporter wants to say, look, agent causation isn't just event causation dressed up fancy. It's an actual different kind of causation, and it allows for freedom, right? So the idea is that when I'm choosing as a rational being, what I'm doing is I'm evaluating reasons. Why should I do this as opposed to this? What reasons are there? And when I engage in that process of deliberation, of choosing, I am actually the beginning of a causal sequence, right? So it's not as though my decision is being made for me by all the events that happened before. I'm initiating a new causal sequence by virtue of my evaluation of these reasons. That's the thought, at least.
Yeah. And you would probably be against this based on the notion that...
Well, I think actually one interesting way to show that agent causation might be difficult to defend is to discuss another experiment. And it was an experiment that was originally done by a scientist by the name of Lebet, and then it has more recently been developed. So Lebet had a way of kind of looking at and attaching electrodes to somebody's brain, head to watch brain activity. And there was a very, very simple choice that the subject needed to make. The subject was going to press a button either with their right index finger or their left index finger. And there's a clock there, and the subject was to take note of the time when they figure out whether they're going to use the right index finger or the left index finger. So the subject would sit there and make this decision. I'm going to use my right index finger. This is what time it is. And Libet and the scientists looking at watching the brain activity were actually able to predict sometimes 7 seconds, 5 seconds before the person knew which finger that they were going to use. So the scientists could see, they're going to use their right index finger before the person had voiced that decision. And so what that seems to suggest is that maybe agent causation isn't quite what's happening there. Maybe what's going on there is the brain is doing the processing, and then the person becomes consciously aware of the decision that the brain has essentially made. But that conscious awareness, it feels like, when we think about free will, we feel like we are doing it. Right? It feels like it's in our conscious brain. And part of what that experiment, and now this more contemporary experiment that can really see the exact part of the brain and what it's doing, again confirming Libet's conclusions that the brain may well be doing, the non-conscious parts of the brain may well be doing the processing of the decision making. It seems to me that would take away from agent causation. It would. Do you agree with that?
Certainly, if we can take the experiments at face value, I think that puts agent causation under a lot of pressure. And I like these experiments. I teach them every semester in the section on free will. But there are some things that we can say to call into question the experiments. The first obvious one is whether what's being picked up here is signal as opposed to random background noise in the brain. Right? There's a lot of activity happening in the brain. Is what's being registered the actual cause of the person's action, or is it just background, back and forth electrochemical activity being processed in the brain? And then a second thing one might call into question is this is a very simple decision, right? This finger or that finger. And most of the decisions we make in life are not like that. Most of the decisions we make are, where am I going to go to graduate school? Am I going to be able to afford this mortgage? Do I want to have a child, right? A lot more than that, right? So to really see that experiment as clinching the case, I agree, it's very suggestive. You'd want to have a look at how those decisions are, whether they're produced in the brain in the same way, whether the unconscious part of the brain makes those decisions for us, and consciousness shows up like the jerk at the office 10 minutes later and says, that was me, I did that.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And it's interesting, though, I think even that point seems to tell against agent causation, because it feels to me like, yeah, you're right, I agree with you, that experiment is a very simple decision, and really when we're thinking about free will, we're talking about those really major decisions. And it seems to me that when we get thinking about those major decisions, and the reasoning that would go into it, the deliberation that the person who is supporting agent causation doesn't seem to allow for the fact that there's so many other things that the person takes into account: their past history, their past beliefs, their consideration of the future. That if agent causation is in some sense a initiation of a new causal series, that it starts right from there without taking into account what happened before, in the way that event causation seems to do, then it does become a little strange how that decision gets made. If you're not taking into account your past beliefs, or you're thinking about some of the things that you did in the past that might affect the future, it seems strange to say that you could just from one spot just initiate a new causal series. It's interesting. So I think we'd both agree on that too. That agent causation, although a very interesting attempt to provide for libertarian free will, perhaps still doesn't quite succeed in providing a compelling account.
Yeah. I'd agree with that. I mean, I kind of stressed when I was describing it that it was the agent causation supporter says that agent causation doesn't ultimately amount to event causation. And I've never really, I mean, I can say those words, but I don't really understand what the claim is behind them. If my decisions are not events, then what are they? If they are events, then we're back at regular old event causation.
Yeah, and you basically agree with that.
Yeah.
I also think what's interesting about agent causation is the way in which, how we're talking about it, we can see how complicated it is in terms of thinking whether or not we have free will or whether or not we are determined. Because right away you were listing off, we have all these different reasons for why we're making decisions, and I think that probably has a big role into playing people believing that we have free will.
Yeah, it's interesting. You're right that that ability to deliberate itself seems to be a sign of free will. Aristotle saw that, and right away he thought that it can't be the case that propositions about the future are true now, because otherwise there would be no need for us to deliberate. Things would, if what is going to happen tomorrow is already true now, I wouldn't deliberate about it. I would just do it. And it's interesting because I think that that's a common misconception of determinism. Many people say, "Oh, you're a determinist, so it doesn't matter what you do; it's all going to happen anyway." And I often have to say, well, I'm not so sure that that's the determinist view. For the determinist, it's very much important, what I do. It's what I do that makes that next thing happen. And I can still deliberate. I want to, I too want to make the decision that is the one that I take to be the best for me. But I do think that in the end, I will always act on that decision that I take to be the best for me.
Yeah, the best one.
Yeah.
Which was determined in a way.
Yeah. So that would seem to suggest that there is only and always only one possible outcome, namely the one that I take to be the best.
Okay. And then deliberation for you, is that in any way tied to probability, which is something you believe in, or do you think that is some saving grace for free will, or?
Well, it might be the case that when I deliberate, this probabilistic component that operates at the quantum level bubbles up, and I end up having a probabilistic causation in my decision making. That on its own, though, isn't going to get you free will. Not of the spontaneous, I'm in control of my actions type way that people seem to, libertarians want to have. And the reason is this: if my decisions are determined, then they're not free in this sense. If instead they're the result of some random probabilistic twist that a quark makes, then that doesn't seem to be the right thing to give me freedom, autonomy, either, right? It seems like, well, now your choice was caused by something random, right? How is that free, right? So whether we're free or not, I think, is a different issue than whether the quantum level is determined or not.
Okay. Yeah.
One thing I did want to touch on that from what Amy was talking about earlier, this feeling that we all have when we're making a decision. I think that's probably the most powerful reason that most people believe in free will. We always have students every year, no matter how many arguments you give them that determinism looks true, they still want to hang on to, no, but I feel free. When I'm making a decision, it's me. And the issue with that, and we all have that, even determinists have that. The issue with that is that there are other experiments carried out in I think it was the 1960s by Jose Delgado's team at Yale, where again they put these electrodes on people's scalp, and this time they fed impulses into the brain to make the person, the subject of the experiment, to make them move a part of their body. So they might stand up, they might look around, they might raise their hand. And you would think they'd get freaked out, right? Because you put yourself in their shoes, suddenly your hand goes up for no reason, right? But that's not what happens. Everybody in the experiment claims that they made a free decision to stand up or turn around or raise their hand, and they'll even give reasons for why they did it, right? They'll say, I thought maybe I dropped something over here, so I turned around to look, or I was restless, so I stood up to walk around. Here's the thing. That feeling of freedom persists even in cases where we know it's unreliable because these people are being manipulated.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's a leap to say sometimes it's unreliable, therefore always it's unreliable, but it's enough to call it the question how strongly we should trust that feeling of freedom. We know it goes wrong sometimes. Should we base our whole conception of self and rationality and deliberation on that feeling?
Oh,
Yeah,
that's
interesting.
very interesting.
It reminds me that I had a student who was a hypnotist, and in front of class, we were talking about free will and determinism. Yeah. He hypnotized somebody, and just gave them the hypnotic suggestion that when he had stopped talking and snapped his fingers, the student would want a Coke. And so, sure enough, he snapped his fingers, and then the student said, I really want a Coke, and I want a bottle of Coke, and we asked him, we were all laughing, and he's looking at us like, why are you laughing at me? But it was that same thing. The question was, did you decide that desire? It was a choice, I think, between Coke and a Sprite or whatever it was. It was your choice. Your choice to choosing that Coke, was that a free choice? Mm-hmm. And the student said, yeah. And so I think there is something to that feeling of freedom, that sense that we have. And I guess, I think that what the determinists would have to say is that feeling is a bit mistaken. It's a bit illusory. Mm-hmm. There are many ways in which we have different illusory beliefs, perhaps for good reason. But I think the determinists would have to say that belief is not one that is reflecting something that's really there.
Interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting.
Yeah. No, I think the hypnosis in general is very interesting because so many times in our actual society, too, we seem like something is the best option, but it's something else that, made us think that. Capitalism is a big, proponent of that, where it's do I want Air Force Ones? Everyone else has Air Force Ones? Of course I do. But then it's did I actually want that? But it was a free choice, so I definitely think that was interesting.
And subliminal advertising, and
exactly.
And there are ways in which we have this sense that, oh no, this was my desire. This initiated for me, when we're not aware of what's really causing the desire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, I know another big objection, maybe one of the biggest objections to determinism and to us not having free will, is the notion that how could we live in a world that doesn't, if we don't have free will, then how can anyone be responsible for their actions? And if no one's responsible for their actions, then where does morality come into play with that? I know you've done a lot with your research on this, so if you want to start off talking. And then
So responsibility is one of the major objections. Moral responsibility is one of the major objections that's raised against the determinist or necessitarian account. And it seems to me that the necessitarian has one of two possible paths to take, which probably sounds funny right now to say. But the one way that they can go is to just say, you know what, if responsibility requires free will, then when free will goes out, responsibility goes with it. And so that's certainly one route that the necessitarian or determinist might take. The other path that the necessitarian might take is to say, we just need to reevaluate what we mean by responsibility and describe it in a way that doesn't entail that a person must have free will in order to be held morally accountable for their actions. I'm not sure which way I lean yet, to be totally honest. There are times when I think, we just should get rid of responsibility, and we should start talking about instead just the reasons and factors that led to the person's actions, and determine whether there's some way that we might be able to affect their actions in the future so they don't do it again, without bringing into the account responsibility at all. So there are certainly times when I lean that way, but I I've heard, the objection raised so many times, and I can, I understand fully, the desire to be able to hold people responsible for their actions. So it might be the case that what needs to happen is just that we need to have a different account of responsibility, one that doesn't include free will. It'd be interesting to figure out, what that might look like.
Yeah, and Professor.
Well, the compatibilist here has something to say. Not me, the compatibilist.
Yeah,
I'm not really a compatibilist, but which is that just as if we define free will in a certain way as freedom from impediment, we can have free will within and determinism within the one position. Likewise, we can have moral responsibility and determinism, and the way that could work would be, you think about how you get, how a child learns right from wrong, right? It's basically a system of praise and punishment, reward and punishment. W.T. Stace, writing in the 1950s, gave an example of if your child starts lying, to prevent him from lying, you might give him, quote, a mild beating, unquote. So we don't beat our children anymore. This is the 1950s. But the idea is there, right? As he puts it, what you want to do, your child doesn't respond to the normal causes that lead a person to be honest. So you want to supply a new line of causation in the shape of pain and fear, right? We don't have to do pain and fear. We can do reward and punishment, right? But what we're ultimately trying to do is teach a child right from wrong, and we use the fact that they can be causally influenced to get that across, right? So the compatibilists can say, look, the whole system of moral responsibility doesn't make any sense unless causal determinism is true. Or that's how we learn it in the first place. And punishing prisoners, punishing criminals is the same idea. We're trying to affect their future behavior. And if we can't do that, or even as an extra bonus, we're trying to affect people who are not criminals. As in, look what happens when you cross this line. You go to this place that you really don't want to go to, right? So they can, the compatibilists can account for moral responsibility in that way. And as we've talked about a couple of times, there's also the idea of punishment as of locking somebody up, not as punishment, but as quarantine, right? Here we all are wearing these masks, right? We can think of criminality along the same lines. Society has to protect itself from people who are going to be violent criminals. Whether that's moral responsibility or whether that's just self-defense is perhaps a moot point. But there is a legitimate reason to incarcerate certain offenders.
And that's, I think the determinist necessitarian would agree with all of that. There was, that would be the same line that the necessitarian would want to take. Certainly, I suppose the only difference would be that the compatibilist would want to say that there's free will in there. And the necessitarian would say, well, no. So exactly the way that Professor McEvoy described it, we do try to causally affect others' actions. It's a form of conditioning behavior. We do it with our pets, and we do it with our kids, and we do it with each other. And I think what the necessitarian might do is to say that it's actually a better way of going about affecting people's behavior. That putting and locking a person up in a cage is not doing any good. And if we're thinking that that's what moral responsibility leads to, I think that's where the necessitarian it gets worried. But I think the compatibilists can agree here. I think the compatibilists and the necessitarian on this account agree a lot, and it really does seem to just come down to the fact that the only difference at that point is that the compatibilists will say that the act that we're trying to change or to affect was one that was done freely.
Right.
And the necessitarian or determinist would say it wasn't done freely.
Yeah. Okay, so another question that I just thought of. I know that you mentioned reinforcement and reward is heavily used on people and it works on people. Do you think that, I think we could probably agree that children and most people are taught and we act in a way in which people believe that there's free will. Even I'm a hard determinist, but I have to, at least in my daily life, to think that I have the choices. Do you think that there would be any benefit from teaching more about determinism from an early age, or do you think we should be doing that?
That's such a tough question. It's one that I think about a lot, because there's something to be said for the prevalence of the belief throughout, human existence. That I'm actually not sure. It may be more a Western belief than an Eastern belief. So maybe it's just prevalent in Western thought. I don't know if it's part of human nature, if it's or if it is something that is genuinely taught. And those are interesting questions.
Yeah.
I myself don't believe that I have free will, and I am able to operate fine in the world, at least so far.
Yeah.
But I do wonder whether young children, non-philosophers, would fully understand what it would mean to live without free will, especially if they've already been raised to believe that they have free will. I wonder if we could just, I wonder if, and I'm thinking of Eastern thinkers at this point who perhaps haven't been raised in that way, who may not have such a difficult time accepting that we don't have free will.
Interesting. And same question for you. I know you have a kid, so.
Yeah. So Emmett is 5, and he definitely has a will. Whether it's free or not is another question. But if the question is like, should we just wholesale start raising our kids to believe that they're not free? Well, that really could only be evaluated by consequences, right? And we just aren't going to know what those consequences are unless we went ahead and did it. Would the world be a better place if we got rid of the notion of moral responsibility and replace it with a notion of determinism? I honestly don't know. There's some reason to think that it would be worse. You can imagine, of course, people making all sorts of excuses for their behavior. You can't blame me for cheating on you. I couldn't have done anything else, right? Yeah, sure, I murdered this person, but come on, you're not going to hold me responsible, are you? So there's definitely a fear of that happening down the line if we went this way. But, we might just as well get some positive consequences. We might, for example, have people be more understanding of the choices people make when they know something about where those people, what they've been through, or where they've come from in terms of their personal history. We might be less inclined to lock people up who originally came from disadvantaged or broken homes. We might be less inclined to lock up people who have addiction problems. There's certainly some potential positives out of getting out from under the notion of more responsibility and understanding things in a more, this happened because of this person's personal history.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So it was, it's that interesting question. Should we raise our children differently? I think you're right. It's a hard one, but I do think that if we were to look at our criminal justice system, and especially in the way that Professor McEvoy was just describing, I do think we could make some real improvements to it if we were to recognize that much of it has so far rested upon the belief that we do have free will, and if we were to reevaluate that and approach it from a deterministic way, and recognize that most people who are in prison have mental health issues or addiction or both, have been had traumatized childhood, have had lack of education, lack of support, that we would become more empathetic, and that we would be able to recognize that they didn't choose to be, in the position that they're in. They didn't choose to be, say, a gang member, or choose to be a pedophile for that matter. I don't know who would possibly choose to be such, but that there are certain factors that resulted in their becoming who they are. And an empathetic approach would allow us then to perhaps educate them, rehabilitate them, to help them to become productive members of society, would certainly be better than locking them in a cage for the rest of their lives. That just seems to be inhumane.
Yeah.
But as Professor McEvoy said before too, there was the problem cases are the ones that can't be rehabilitated. They're really, really troubling issues. And then I think that the method of quarantine works well there. That there just may well be some members of society who we need to keep away from others so that they don't harm them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
No, yeah, same. I think that determinism gives some sort of grace to a lot of people who do follow under these markers of they're probably going to end up like this. But I do know that part of rehabilitation, unfortunately, is like taking away from society so that they have the time to change. And the question comes in with that, or I have had a professor object to me saying that can be a form of punishment for that person. So then what do you do there? Is there even rehabilitation without punishment or without attaching some sort of, free will to that? So.
It's interesting. So Norway has been experimenting with this, and they actually do consider it still a form of punishment.
Okay.
But the prisoners are in they each have their own room, very nice bed, TV, their own bathroom. They're treated like human beings. But they're at the same time taught how to be productive members of society. And they are treated well.
Mm-hmm.
And they have had a lot of success with it. So it's interesting that question that would it still be a form of punishment? And it is interesting that Norway still considers that their punishment, but it's a form of punishment that involves rehabilitation, education. Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah. And in terms of free will and determinism, do you think that it would have any effect on like philosophy of time? Does it ever get into anything like that?
Sometimes. So there are various theories of what time is. Just real quick, presentism is the theory that only the present moment exists. Future, past, not real. The growing block theory, the past is real, the present is real, but the future is not. On either of these views, it seems like there's room for the future to be open, right? It could grow in a different way than it actually does grow. Then there's this theory called the frozen block view, which is that past, present, future are equally real. They all exist. If we could time travel to the future, that could only be because the future is real, right? If it's not real, you couldn't possibly go there, right? And some people have held that if past, present, and future all exist and are equally real, that means that determinism must be true. After all, there's only one real future. Now, some people who have proposed this view from within the philosophy of time, I think D.C. Williams, holds that, look, how the frozen block is composed is an open question. Maybe it's composed by strict determinist causation. Maybe it's composed by random events. Maybe there's no such thing as causation, right? There's a frozen block. It could get there in any one of those ways. So there is a temptation to think of that theory as a natural ally of determinism, but it doesn't have to be.
Very interesting. So now, Professor Karofsky and McEvoy, throughout this discussion, we've had some questions submitted that our audience have sent in, and we just want to go through some of them now for the last bit of the show. So, for Professor Karofsky, how can determinism explain having intentions and beliefs, such as wanting a coffee?
Oh, yeah. So the physicalist determinist, the person that thinks that we're just a bunch of physical stuff, would probably explain that by appeal to, especially coffee. I identify totally. I cannot. First thing I do when I wake up in the morning is get that cup of coffee. And I think that there's a part of me that I'm sure it's a somewhat of something like an addiction. I'm sure that,
Yeah.
and there's the patterns in my brain that I have created, that this is my routine. So I'm sure it's partly that I wake up in the morning and it is the first thing I think about. So I would think that there are some ways to explain that by appeal to the physical brain, by appeal to the routine that I've set, by appeal perhaps to that caffeine that's, I'm maybe a little addicted to. And I think that the determinists would say, I can have the intention when I wake up to get that cup, and I'll go downstairs and I make it, and I can have the belief that I want it, and I go ahead and act on that belief. But there's nothing in that suggests that my actions were free. In fact, a lot of that feels like it's just not free at all.
Very good. Very good. Now, Professor McEvoy, can you show free will and determinism with the classical trolley problem?
Well, the classic trolley problem is there is a streetcar or a trolley heading down on a line, and if there's some people on the line.
Yeah.
There's 5 people on the line in one case, and you can divert the trolley to a side rail where there's one person. Right now, if you divert it, you're going to kill this one person. You'll save the 5. If you don't divert it, and so people have this idea that diverting it, you're more sort of causally responsible for the death of the one.
Yeah.
Whereas if you don't do anything, you've only allowed to happen the death of the 5. You didn't actually do it yourself. Yeah, I've never been particularly persuaded by that by that analysis of the case. I definitely here have utilitarian tendencies. You try and save as many people as possible, given that somebody's got to feel the brunt of the trolley. How does that play in with free will? What's the question about free will or determinism specifically?
How does that can that show free will and determinism? Do you think we're predisposed to choose one way depending on certain circumstances?
Well, if determinism is true, a particular real human being standing there is going to be predisposed or predetermined, in fact, to act one way rather than the other. Whether that person is predetermined to leave things be, or whether they're predetermined to, push the lever, that's going to depend on that person's causal history, right?
Yeah.
Their nature and their nurture. Some people will do it, some people won't, and the determinists will explain that difference by way of their differing causal histories up to this point. So yeah, I think the determinists can analyze the case. I think it's one of these issues that cuts at cross angles from determinism. It's not like if you're a determinist you'll do this, if you're a libertarian you'll do that. It's just the determinists will have something to say about it.
Yeah. What about the compatibilist?
I think the compatibilist is going to give you the same answer, right?
But would one of those be free? Would one of those I guess it would still? Yeah, is that I think is one of those tricky questions for the compatibilists. Sometimes you have to make one choice or the other. You either don't push the lever or you do.
Sure, but unless someone is like grabbing your hand and making you pull the lever, then whatever you do as a compatibilist, you're doing without being coerced to do it. Of course, given that you have to make a choice, that's perhaps a kind of coercion. But even a libertarian is going to be subject to that kind of coercion.
But even like the gun to the head example there's still that choice. It's just it's not a choice that you'd be likely to make. That's interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting question.
Okay, so the next question: doesn't the unpredictability of electrons prove that determinism is false? Whoever wants to answer.
I mean, I think that yes, if there is genuine indeterminacy at that quantum level, then the determinism is false. I'm not so sure that there is. I'm not so sure I accept the scientific claim that there is genuine indeterminacy. I think that the probabilities are actually something that we impose upon the situation, we don't know all of the factors. If we were an all-knowing being, or if we knew all the factors, we wouldn't have to assign probability, or we'd assign 100% probability. It would be a 1%, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But we would know which way the event was going to turn out and how it was going to happen. So yes, I think the answer to that question is yes. If there's genuine indeterminacy at that level, then yeah, determinism is false. But it doesn't necessarily mean necessitarianism is false. It would still need to be shown that what happens indeterminately could have happened otherwise in order for necessitarianism to be false.
Thank you. The next question. Would you agree with the statement that many worlds' interpretation of quantum mechanics is exclusively compatible with a deterministic worldview?
Exclusively? So the many world view of causation at the quantum level is anytime there's a decision, so to speak, to be made when the quantum particle could go one way rather than another, we branch into a different world. In one world, the quantum particle behaves one way. The 5% of the time that it behaves differently, that's explained by there being a different, equally real, but different alternate reality, a different world. If that's so, it certainly looks as though each individual world could only come out one way. Right? Anytime there's a possibility that something different might happen, what happens is one world stays along that path and a new world branches off. Right, so in the world where you've worn a red top, right, that world branched off from this world, and you're still in the black top wearing world. So it looks like on that view, each world can only have one outcome. Whether that's causal determinism or not, I don't know, because remember, the whole way in which we come by causation is by noticing repeated trials. And one popular view of what causation is look, if you take all the nearby possibilities, if two events happen one after the other, then that's a causal relation. But here, the many worlds thing, each world is its own setup.
Yeah.
Right? So is there going to be causation in that world? I don't know. If there is causation, then it seems to me to be deterministic causation.
So thank you so much. Unfortunately, I know we could keep going forever, but that's all the time that we have. Thank you to Dr. Karofsky and Dr. McEvoy for joining us today, and thank you to the Hofstra Philosophy Department for their support. If you're interested in learning more about philosophy of free will or other philosophical topics, be sure to get in touch with the Philosophy Department by visiting 211 Hager Hall or going online to hofstra.edu/philosophy. Thanks again for joining us. I'm Ella Marsh, and this is the School of Hofstra.